Welcome to this Tutor to You Paper 1 and Paper 3 walkthrough for AQA A Level Sociology. In this video we're going to look at the 10-mark outline and explain questions that specifically focus on research methods. The 10-mark outline and explain questions on theory and methods appear on both Paper 1 and Paper 3, and they're focused on either research methods only, sociological theory, or key debates, which mixes a little bit of sociological theory and a little bit of research methodology. These are not to be confused with the 10-mark outline and explain questions on Paper 2, which have a different skill set. For this question, you're looking to put in 2 extended paragraphs that are largely based upon your knowledge of these areas. It requires students to show very good knowledge to get into the 8 to 10 level, the top level on the mark scheme. And in these questions, you do not have to evaluate. In fact, evaluation would not be credited on this question. If we look at a sample question, this is one we've focused on research methods only, and it is a comparative question. It asks you to outline and explain 2 reasons sociologists might choose unstructured interviews over structured interviews. And we've seen this format before in exams, particularly with observations. With the 4 and the 6 mark questions, we talked about a cause and an effect. And often that is the case in the 10 mark questions as well. However, with this comparative style of question, we have to look at this very differently. Instead of a specific cause and effect, what we have to look at is the 2 different methods. So we have our unstructured interviews and structured interviews. And when we're decoding this question, we have to be able to demonstrate knowledge of unstructured interviews and knowledge of structured interviews. Because it's asking you, the student, reasons why sociologists might choose one method over another, you need to demonstrate knowledge of both of those methods. So let's have a look at some of the features of unstructured and structured interviews. So we know that unstructured interviews are preferred by interpretivist sociologists. We also know that structured interviews are preferred by positivists. Now this might be one point that you develop, that a sociologist's methodological preference is one of the reasons why they select unstructured over structured interviews. Generally speaking, for research methods questions, unless it specifies a particular type of practical, ethical or theoretical strength or limitation, theoretical ones are the easiest to be able to develop fully. So looking at a sociologist's methodological or theoretical preference is a really useful way of being able to develop your answer fully. We also know that unstructured interviews can help us to develop a rapport, whereas structured interviews are more standardized. This might be something we can develop within our point on methodology. We know that with unstructured interviews we can probe deeper and ask follow-up questions, whereas with structured interviews they follow an interview schedule, and this might influence a sociologist's choice of these methods. We know that we get higher validity with unstructured interviews. They measure what they're supposed to be measuring. We gain a greater insight, and we could potentially obtain Verstehen through conducting unstructured interviews. Whereas structured interviews have higher reliability. We are able to repeat them. We're able to give them out over a larger scale because of their standardized nature. And finally, we know that unstructured interviews provide us largely with qualitative data, whereas structured interviews will give us quantitative data. So the type of data that a researcher wants might also be a reason why they choose an unstructured over a structured interview. If we look at our sample response, you would start each paragraph by identifying the reason, So here we've put one reason the sociologists might choose to use unstructured interviews rather than structured interviews is their methodological preference. So we're going with a theoretical strength and limitation here. We're going to identify which group are more likely to choose it. So interpretivists prefer to use unstructured interviews. And now we're going to develop that point a little bit by talking about how it enables them to develop a rapport with their subjects, and as a result it allows the researcher to gain more information about a specific topic area. So we're answering half of the question here as to why they might choose unstructured interviews. We also need to link this back as to why they would choose that method over structured interviews. It enables them to interpret cause and effects, which is less likely with a structured interview due to the standardized nature of structured interviews. Now we would develop this point a little bit further and use an example. And it's really useful in the research methods questions to be able to have an example of each of those methods and maybe a strength or a limitation that that method had. So here we've focused on Oakley, using unstructured interviews in her research as it has enabled her to gain a better insight into the experience of women in her research and allowed her to address some of the issues that women were facing. This allowed her to be on a similar level to the women she was interviewing, which is a feature of interpretivist and feminist research methodology. What you're demonstrating to the examiner here is that you know that it's not only interpretivists who use this method, but also feminist research, and how feminist research was influenced by interpretivist ideas. The use of unstructured interviews, particularly when Oakley was talking about the conventional family and when she was studying women who were pregnant. And to finish this off, again, we talk about why it's not possible with the other method. Due to the format of researchers asking questions from a specific interview schedule, we're going back to that point, the idea of it being standardised, and respondents answering them, it gives them little freedom to respond in the way they want to. Quite a well-developed response. We've talked quite extensively and showed a lot of knowledge of unstructured interviews. We've applied it to a specific piece of research, and we've also highlighted to the examiner that we've got knowledge of structured interviews and why they are not chosen in this circumstance. Let's look at a second response. A second reason some sociologists might choose to use unstructured interviews rather than structured interviews is the research topic. So again, we're going with a theoretical idea, but we're showing our knowledge of sociological research methods and the topic. Unstructured interviews are useful in investigating issues that require the researcher to collect qualitative data. Now, some may say that this really is the way, that we're really looking at a reason being collecting qualitative data rather than quantitative data. We're going to focus on the topic. Topics that are either sensitive or complex are better investigated using unstructured interviews as they allow the researcher to ask follow-up questions and probe deeper and get a wider range of responses. How does that compare to structured interviews? This is not possible with structured interviews as the standardized nature of the interviews mean researchers cannot go off topic. We go back to our knowledge of unstructured interviews and we're applying an example. Unstructured interviews are often used in education for issues such as identity formation and investigating the impacts of teacher interactions on pupils, both of which are sensitive and complex issues that are better understood through the collection of qualitative rather than quantitative data. This is why researchers might choose to use unstructured interviews. So you can see what we've done in both of these is we've not only talked about our unstructured interview in a positive way, but we've also discussed the limitations of using a structured interview in the same instance. We've applied an example. It doesn't necessarily have to be a specific piece of research. In our second point, we've looked at it being applied to specific topic areas. But what you're demonstrating to an examiner is that you have a lot of knowledge about structured and unstructured interviews and the reasons why some sociologists would prefer to use an unstructured interview over a structured interview. To end, we're going to talk about some exam gold. These outline and explain questions on papers 1 and 3 do not require you to evaluate. They focus on you showing your knowledge of the issues presented rather than spending time to evaluate it. It's not credited. So if you write half a paragraph on evaluation, getting a good answer, but because evaluation is not credited, you're wasting a little bit of your time and you're wasting a bit of your development. So on the 10 mark, outline and explain on paper 1 and paper 3, you do not need to evaluate. This is questions 6 on paper 1 and 5 on paper 3. That concludes this Tutor to You paper 1 and paper 3 walkthrough for AQA A Level Sociology, looking at the 10 mark outline and explain methods questions. Thanks for watching.